Welcome to LATTC summer class, real-time videos. Thank you, Jose Negrete. Introduction to 3D Studio.
It records audio?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. All right, so I want to cover some of the interface before we go into modeling head. So the first thing I always do in 3D Studio, especially if I'm using a computer that's not my own, is to set the units. So in order to do that, we're going to click on Customize and then click on Unit Setup. Now here the most important button is the very top one, which says System Unit Setup. And here we want to make sure that we're in inches. That just happens to be the default that we work with. If you happen to be working with something like a civil drawing, then you would set this to feet so that it would match your AutoCAD civil drawing. But by default, we usually stick to inches here. So we just want to double check those system units, and then the next thing you want to do is select your display units. So here we want to use a US standard to match our system units. And here you can use your personal preference, so you can have your units displayed in feet with decimal inches, or just decimal inches, or feet with fractional inches. I usually keep it at either decimal inches or feet with decimal inches. And then immediately below that you have your default units. So here your options are feet or inches. And what this means is if in any of the values you type the number 1, for example, and hit enter, if it's set to feet, it's going to mean that the 1 is 1 foot, right? And if it's set to inches, it'll be 1 inch. So again, this is your personal preference. I usually keep this at inches myself. Then hit OK. Now here under the main toolbar, which is this guy here, the most important tools are your Select Objects tool, and I have my cursor over it here if you can see on the top left of the screen. Select Objects, Select by Name. What this one does is it brings up a list of every object in your scene, so you can select your object by its name. Makes it easier to select things once you have a scene with dozens of objects in it. So you would open your list, select your object, and hit OK. Next here is Select and Move, followed by Select and Rotate, and Select and Scale. So these are the 4 or 5 that you want to always remember. Those are your main manipulation tools. Then Marcela mentioned you were covering materials. The material editor icon is further to the right, and the keyboard shortcut key for this is the letter M on your keyboard. That's the default shortcut key. If you guys want to look up the rest of the shortcuts, you can click on Help and click on Keyboard Shortcut Map. And if this opens, it should show you the default keyboard shortcuts.
Under the help, you can also find all the information about any command or anything you have a help.
I guess it's not working. Okay, so then we'll go to the command panel at the far right. So here the first 2 tabs at the very top are the ones you want to always look at. The very first tab is the Create tab, and immediately below that you have your subcategories. So here's Geometry is selected by default, that's your 3D objects. Next is Shapes, those are 2D objects. Next is Light Objects, Cameras. Then we have helpers, space warps, and systems, but the ones you'll usually use the most is geometry, so that you can have some basic 3D primitive to start out with. So since that's the one that's selected, we'll cover that. So here we're again under the Create tab, then Geometry, and then we have an additional submenu here, so it's set to standard primitives by default. So here we can find box, sphere, cylinder, torus, teapot, and so on. So once you want to use one of these, you have to click it And once it's highlighted, you can click and drag anywhere in your viewport to start to create the object. So in the case of the box, we have to set both the length and width. And once we release the mouse, it lets us set a height for it. And usually this type of object I'll eyeball, and then I'll set the dimensions afterwards. So now that we've placed the box, the next tab at the top is called the Modify tab. So this tab is where we would go to specify the dimensions for the box. So here we can set length, width, and height. So we can make it 10 inches cubed. And you'll notice in the parameters below the dimensions you have segments. So this, what this does is it adds divisions in your polygons. So here we can increase this, and it starts to look kind of like a Rubik's Cube. The reasons you would want additional segments is if you're trying to modify this object, you can depending on what modifier you want to add to it, you would need additional segments or more faces.
Because once it's divided, you can choose one of the cubes and extrude it, enlarge it, distort it, but it belongs still to the larger cube. So that's probably the most important quality that 3D Studio has, how you can modify these type of objects.
Right. Once you've placed a primitive object, you would want to modify it at what's called the sub-object level. So this cube is made up of vertices, which are points, edges, polygons, and elements. But I want to place a few more of these primitives before we cover the sub-objects. So back to the Create tab. Under Geometry, I'm just going to create a sphere here. So it's the same thing. We're going to click and drag in the viewport, only that the sphere doesn't have a third step. You just click and drag and that sets the sphere's radius. And then again, once we've placed it, we can go to the Modify tab and change the dimension for the sphere. So we can say this is a 6-inch radius, which would make it a 12-inch diameter. And then back to the Create tab, we'll do cylinder. And this one's similar to the box, where you click and drag to set the cylinder's radius. And once you release the mouse, it lets you specify a height. And then again, we're going to the Modify tab to change the dimensions. So here I made it 6-inch radius and 1 foot height.
So this concludes the introduction to 3D Studio. Video number 2, we're going to go with the first assignment of how do you modify a sphere to convert it into the animal of view. Thank you.